Hi there, Neil from Diagonal Move here, doing my version of an unboxing here with a component overview for The Lamps Are Going Out, a Compass Games game all about World War One, designed by Kirk Ullman. Second edition of this particular game. Box is pretty sturdy. The front cover has a rogues gallery of historical figures displaying the facial hair trends of the day. Unfortunately, I'm completely ignorant about the names of any of these people, but I can only assume they are the leaders of one or other of the powers involved in the First World War. Looking at the rear of the box then, it's quite a chunky box. We have the usual kind of blurb about the game. In this case, it's a strategic level game starting in 1914, going through to November 1918, so the whole of the First World War. It's all about moving your armies around the fields of battle, mostly in Europe, but with some elements of Africa and the Caucasus as well. There's elements of U-boats and technology advances, things like that in this particular game, and it does this through a variety of mechanics or mechanisms to do with cards. It's a card assisted game rather than a card driven game, but mostly it's area movement type stuff. The complexity information down the side, we have a medium complexity game. The time scale is 1 turn equals 3 months, which I hope is not real time. Map scale is strategic. We have unit scale of army. Players is 1 to 4, but best with 2. Now the reason this is 1 to 4, best with 2, is that you can play solo, playing both sides to the best of your ability. There are no hidden mechanics or anything like that. The reason it's best with 2 rather than done with 3 or 4 is because each player would control several factions, and there's basically more to do with the main factions than there is with the smaller factions, is my understanding. I've only had a very brief skim through the rules. Average time to play is actually 5 hours, so not 3 months as I was fearing, and the recommended age is 14 plus. Okay, so let's have a look at what we get in the box, and then I'll look at everything in a little bit more detail in a moment. Okay, so apologies for the glare at the top of the screen there, but we have some oversized dice, which I will just run through the dice tower test to make sure they actually roll, and yep, they fit in my dice tower, which is something of a novelty with games from Compass. These deluxe editions tend to have massive oversized dice, but those aren't too bad. There are then 2 packets of cards. These are not particularly sorted, so when I look at them in more detail, I will sort them into their various decks. There is a almost obligatory these days note regarding an errata. In this case, it refers to a misprint in the rulebook around factories being valued at 4 for production rather than 5, so not too bad. We have the player aid chart. Back of one side is the setup for both sides, and then the other side is in this case, the Central Powers player aid. And these are slightly different for the Central Powers and the Entente because there's a slightly different, very slightly different sequence of play for each side. What's interesting about this though is we also have this sort of dual purpose player aid where we do have boxes for unit holding and things like that on the player aid, which is it's almost a holding box as well as a player aid. We'll get into more of that later, I guess, or maybe not, since I've already gone through it. The other ones, we have actually four copies of that, 2 for the Central Powers and then 1 for the Triple Entente. And again, if we just have a very quick look, we have certain things that the Western Allies can do, and then certain things that Germany only can do, and that relates to the factions that are in the game. This is just a copy of the Triple Entente player aid. We have 2 counter sheets. The first one has the Triple Entente and its allies, with the allies being the green and the Entente being the brown, which is my understanding. So we sort of have Russia, America, and then the British, French, and so on, and various markers that we would use throughout the game. And when we look at the cards and the counters in more detail, perhaps we'll have a quick look at what some of those cards do to reflect why we have so many different markers in the game. Similar sheet for the I keep wanting to say Axis, but it's actually the Central Powers. We have the Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Turkey, and then a few others dotted around as well as sort of various markers for production and the game turn, things like that. These counters are pretty decent. They're not the thickest counters in the world, but they are pre-rounded, which I personally quite like, rather than having to trim your own corners and stuff, because I'm basically not very good at it. So yeah, I quite like that. They do pop out really, really easily, so I'm going to have fun punching those later. Rulebook. The rulebook is fairly chunky. It's nice and glossy as well. Tell it's a second edition. 36 pages in total, but the back of the book we have probably the better part of 10 pages as designer notes and an example of play. Now the rulebook itself is pretty well laid out actually. I mean, I only had a skim, like I said, but it gives you a decent sense of everything that's going on in the game. There's lots of illustrations, and as you can see, we have event cards for the Western Allies, the Eastern Allies, Central Powers, and then Germany. So yeah, and each player in a 2-player game would control 2 of those. For 3- and 4-player game, you would divide those out amongst different people. There's also technology cards, and we'll look at these cards in a bit more detail in a moment, but this is almost a tech tree to represent things, tanks, flamethrowers, stuff like that, as they all those new technologies that were brought out for the first time or used for the first time during the First World War. Okay, so quite a lot of information. Now, one thing I have noticed about this, and as I said, I've only had a skim read, seems relatively simple in the sense you move, you do some combat with the dice, so not too complex in the way it actually plays, but then there's what appears to be many different restrictions on certain movements for certain countries, things like that, and then those procedures vary depending on the circumstances as well. So we have attack procedures for occupied areas, unoccupied enemy areas, unoccupied previously friendly areas, things like that. There's also a reflection of the Russian political situation at the time around the Russian Revolution, things like that. We have the East African element of the game. There's trench combat, and it's all in these kind of nicely laid out rules. And as you can see, many of these cards here are the technologies that come in. So I'll look at those more when we look at the cards. U-boats are represented in an abstract way, and the attrition that goes on through the supply lines and so on with the U-boat warfare. And as we move through, what else have we got? We've got things like regrouping, and some of those political issues I mentioned to do with certain nations. And at the back, I have a little description about the solitaire play, which I summarised very quickly. As far as I can tell, it's a single game. There's no scenarios in here. It doesn't appear to be any other smaller scenarios. So I think you essentially play the game until one side has won. And then there's a whole bunch of designer notes, things like that. We also have a second glossy booklet, which is really cool. So we have some deep design notes. So although there's design notes in the main rulebook, there's also this deeper dive here, and it talks about the technologies, the reasoning behind a second edition, and also how things are reflected in the game. So I mean, this is more of a, obviously you can sit and read this in the evening sort of thing. And it talks about Russian occupation, using the event cards to reflect some of that historical detail. There are optional cards in this edition because obviously it's a second edition. They were able to move more into sort of the bells and whistles that you might, or the chrome that you might not have had in the first edition. So a whole bunch of different technology cards, each one with a description of what the card does, and then also some sort of historical information as well. I must confess I'm not super up to date with the historical situations for the First World War. I have very broad knowledge, and so things like this is actually quite interesting for me personally. And there's a whole bunch of different things, and you can sort of get a sense of things that they have. So people who are more familiar with these things may know about Entente, especially in Serbia, Zeppelin and Gotha raids, Salonika, The Italy joins the Triple Entente, there's a Treaty of London, and all these things have different effects in the game, and each card is played at a certain point or becomes available at a certain historical year. Okay, so that's that book, pretty cool, and there's a bunch of optional cards on the back as well. The only other thing to highlight here, and we'll look at this in more detail shortly, is this map. Quite a big, chunky, mounted map. Okay, let me spend a bit of time sorting out those cards, and I'll come back and we'll look at those cards and then the map in a little bit more detail. I've separated the decks out into their different parts, and there's 3 for effectively each side in the game. There are event cards for Germany, for their Central Allies, and then there are Central Powers technology cards. And those are almost the tech tree, if you like. We have an equivalent for the Western Allies, the Eastern Allies, and the Triple Entente. And when you are playing, one player will control 2 factions in a side. And if you're playing multiplayer, you would basically have a deck each and play through as 4 players with one side controlling half of a faction, if that makes any sense at all. The cards themselves are pretty decent quality. They're not the thickest in the world, but they're pretty solid. The text is pretty clear, and there's a bit of info around what the cards do, as well as what the historical background is. The card I've got here is an aerial reconnaissance card, which is the Western Allies' ability to place an additional air superiority marker on the board. Presumably there is a P2 somewhere, which I will just have a quick shuffle through. And yeah, here we go. So we have, the baseline technology and then the more advanced technology, which in this case is synchronized machine guns. And so as they go through, there is this small tech tree going on. The Ps go to 3 levels, U-boats have a couple, and then we have sort of artillery with a couple, and then a few with just 1 level. But this basically lets you do extra things as the war progresses to allow you to reflect the changing technologies of the times. That was the Triple Entente. This is the Central Powers equivalent, and it's broadly the same. We have artillery of various levels, a couple of things like gas and counter batteries that are on their own, and then some aircraft related cards, and the U-boats. I think I haven't looked in great detail, but I just wonder how different they are from each other, those sides, because presumably the technologies would be similar. Once one side had it, the others would be racing to catch up, I'm sure. Could have a quick look actually just to see, couldn't we, while we're here? Okay, so heavy artillery. You get 2 heavy artillery units. Ally gets 1 heavy artillery unit on both sides. Yeah, they're basically the same. So the tech tree almost represents an arms race, which is quite nice. And you draw those at a certain point in the game, and you can play them to support your ongoing campaign. So that's the tech cards on both sides. The event cards will be drawn at the start of a turn, that's my understanding, and then they will be applicable to that turn. So they'll modify somehow the game for that turn only. I say only, there may be some that do more. I haven't looked in great detail about that, but essentially each faction within the sides will have a turn, and you'll turn the card over, that'll be applicable, and then it'll be discarded, and the next player or the next faction will go and take their turn. So for example, let's just have a quick look at what some of the things we have in here. So this is the Central Allies one. There are quite a few, I have to be said, and the cards themselves are quite nice. Again, they're nice and thick, and it says something like Central Power Starvation 1917 onwards. It's applicable, and it has an impact on the production phase for the Central Powers and also for Germany, with Shackled to a Corpse, Lawrence of Arabia, Skoda Works, and I mean I haven't sorted these out into their individual years at the moment, but essentially as you progress through the years you'll have more cards available to you, and certain cards will occur or be seen when the applicable year arrives on the turn track. The Rasputista, I believe, is one example of one of those optional cards that's been brought in for this edition. And that's really, really sort of nice way to do it. So it becomes card assisted rather than card drawn. And everybody has something pretty similar. Here we have something more specific to Germany, the East Asia Squadron, Bruce Miller's Steel Rain, Shell Shock. And they do things like 2 DRMs, they impact certain tracks on the board, combat modifiers, things in the blockade boxes, and we'll look at the map in a bit more detail in a minute, so some of this makes a bit more sense. But, basically it affects the board state for a limited time, these cards. Okay, and there's a whole bunch. I haven't counted, but I think the factions all have the same number. Eastern Allies now, just a quick skim through, as we just, there we go. Oh, something about the Russian Civil War there, so we have historical events in here, Russian Revolution, Zimmerman telegram. Okay, so the only one remaining is the Western Allies. And again, we have mustard gas, tank corps, USA's vested interests, mines, various other things there. I find them pretty easy to read. It's nicely the way it's done as a newspaper, and it's pretty clear what they do. I can't very quick skim through. I can't see anything obviously odd in the way they're laid out or anything like that. So hopefully they'll be nice and easy to use. But one thing I will say, and I'm going to use just because I have the counter sheet here, the Germany counter sheet. So I'm going to go to I think it's the Central Allies. And on the back, I pick a couple of cards just for demo. And I'll just move these cards out, these piles out the way actually. So just as a demo, it says on these cards, and the eagle-eyed amongst you may have seen the phrase place. It says place in Berlin, place in Vienna, right? And that relates to the markers on this board. So markers that you place on the board. So for example, central power starvation is this counter. And what you'll do is you'll place the counter in Berlin, which is there, and that is a visual reminder of the effects of the cards, and I'll tell you what that marker means when you go through. Shackled to a corpse is this one just here, and you'll see that there will go in Vienna. And so these cards put markers on the board, and that I think that's quite a nice touch actually, personally. I really do. And that particular one, Shackled to a Corpse, is a remainder of the game effect, it seems, whereas this one appears to be more limited in its effect. Okay, so that's why we have so many different markers with so many events. You actually get to physically place them on the board, which is kind of cool. Look at the map. Now, this board is pretty big. It's way too big to play on this coffee table, especially when you consider the player aids will have to sit on the side. So each player will have a player aid, and you'll have sort of eliminated markers, and obviously units use markers, things like that. You'll actually have to place on the side. I have nowhere near enough room on this table for that, so I'll have to go on a bigger table. Bear that in mind. So even though the board itself is, within a reasonable size, it's not massively oversized or anything, but it certainly will need a bigger table than I've got right here. I may even have to sort of put it out on the dining table, something like that, which can be interesting for a 5-hour game. Okay, but the board itself, it's pretty clear. It's area movement. You've got things on it like production, flags, which I believe represent home areas, different terrain features, things like that, all of which have certain rules and so on in the game that you would need to bear in mind when you play. The block areas are places like Switzerland, the Netherlands, I'm assuming over there, which are not directly involved in the game, and you cannot actually use those spaces. You do have, down here a nice terrain key, which explains all that pretty clearly. There are various areas that are sort of neutral, and there are certain rules around when you can go into Albania, things like that. We have ports to allow for amphibious invasions, sea movements. Got sort of Great Russia there. If I move the board down a wee bit, right at the very, very top, we've got a marker for the Russian Revolution. Turn sequence reminder here, it goes Germany, the Western Allies, the Eastern Allies and the USA, then the Central Allies. The US are represented all the way over there by a box, splash the camera, by a box, and as you look through, you can start to see some of the abstraction that's gone in the game. So East Africa is almost like a point-to-point map, kind of. I'm not quite sure how it works at the moment, but it's certainly got a visually similar to some of those States of Siege type tracks. No idea if that's how it plays, but that's interesting there. Similarly, over in the Caucasus, we have Damascus, the Sinai, and the Caucasus at the top there, equally represented by those more point-to-point tracks, whereas everything else is area-based. There are snow markers, presumably for the bad weather in Russia. And then over here we have Hague Convention and unrestricted submarine warfare boxes, which I believe is the abstraction for the submarine warfare, and the naval blockades, which you may or may not be able to see right up the top there, which again is how naval combat is represented in the game. My understanding is that air combat is represented through those markers and those technology cards. Anything else on the board that I need to bear in mind? Yes, there is the turn track. So there's a few different tracks on the board as well. This one here being the USA declares war. So there's going to be sort of a manipulation of this track in order to get to the point where the USA at the top there does eventually come into the game. And then the turn track itself, if I can move the board without knocking it off the table completely, we have a turn track with quite a lot of turns, and it goes fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, and so on. And there are certain reminders on the track. For example, trenches, there's a mark there for the trenches in spring 1915. One above it is winter 1914, which shows you when Turkey comes into the war, and things like that. There are other reminders on the board around certain special rules. For example, there's only transfer between those 2 points if Gallipoli and Anatolia are triple entente controlled, and that's quite helpful, I think. I'm hoping there's more of that on the player aid, because there are a lot of little rules and restrictions and things like that as far as I could see. Although the basics just seem to be a case of move people from one place to another, have a fight. Okay, and with that gross simplification of the game, I'm going to pause there. Hopefully you've got a good sense of what's in the box, maybe a little bit of an overview of how the game works as well, with my very limited knowledge at this point. Aim to get a video done as soon as I've managed to actually get the game played. Until then, thanks for watching, and see you for the next one.